By the time my father finished his speech disowning us in front of 80 guests, my brother and I had already spent 11 months quietly buying every debt that kept his estate standing, and in 48 hours, the signature on one folder would take it all away. We are Nora and Cole Calloway, 34 and 29, the two children our family decided weren't built for this, and the two people who turned out to be the only ones who actually understood the numbers. You were both a disappointment we tried very hard not to admit out loud. That's how my father opened it, into a microphone, in front of 80 guests, holding a glass of champagne like he was toasting a business deal instead of erasing his two oldest children from his will. The string lights kept twinkling like nothing had happened. The band kept playing low. Nobody stopped chewing. I stood there in the dress I'd bought for what I thought was a celebration, and felt my spine turn to glass. Beside me, my brother didn't move either. He just exhaled once, slow, the way he does before he signs off on a structural report he already knows is bad news. My mother reached for my father's arm and added, soft enough to sound gentle and loud enough for the back tables to hear, "We did everything we could for you too. Some children just aren't built for this family." Then she smiled at the cameras. I want you to remember that smile, because it's the last one she'll ever give that actually means what she thinks it means. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my clutch, found my phone, and typed 4 words to my brother under the table where no one could see. He read them, looked up at me once, and nodded. Neither of us said a single thing to our parents that night. We didn't need to. What none of them understood, not my father with his champagne, not my mother with her rehearsed grief, not my sister already filming the scene for her followers, was that the text I'd just sent wasn't a complaint. It was a command. And in exactly 48 hours, the family that just told 80 guests we weren't built for this was going to find out they no longer owned the floor they were standing on. Welcome back to Quiet Reckoning Stories, where the people written out of the will are usually the ones holding the deed. If you've ever been told you weren't enough by people who were living off what you built, this one is for you. Drop a comment with your age and where you're watching from, and subscribe, because what my brother and I did next took 11 months to set up and 40 minutes to finish. My name is Nora Calloway. I'm 34. My brother Cole is 29. We are, as our mother liked to put it at dinner parties for most of our adult lives, the practical ones. I'm a forensic financial auditor. I spend my days untangling other people's debt, finding the places where the numbers were supposed to balance and quietly don't. Cole is a structural engineer who runs a small private investment firm on the side, the kind that buys distressed assets nobody else wants to touch. We are not flashy. We don't get invited to the parts of the family photo that go on the mantle. For most of our lives, that suited our parents perfectly, because the version of us that didn't photograph well was also the version that kept writing checks nobody ever planned to pay back. Here is the shape of my family, so the rest of this makes sense. My father, Richard Calloway, built his name on a real estate fortune that peaked 20 years ago and has been quietly decaying ever since, propped up by loans he never told anyone about and a lifestyle he refused to downsize. My mother, Diane, has spent 3 decades curating the appearance of that fortune, the right clubs, the right charity boards, the right daughter standing beside her in every photo. And my younger sister, Savannah, 27, is that daughter. Savannah married Drew Prescott 2 years ago, a rising state senator with a jaw made for campaign posters and a habit of needing other people's money to fund his ambitions. To my parents, Savannah wasn't just their favorite. She was the proof that the Calloway name still meant something. Cole and I were the ones who actually kept the lights on while that proof was being manufactured, and we were never, not once, thanked for it. I want to be honest about something before I take you further back, because I think you deserve to know exactly who you're rooting for. Cole and I didn't start this with revenge in our hearts. We started it the way people like us start everything, with a spreadsheet. It was 11 months before that party, on a Tuesday night, when my father called me, not Cole, me specifically, because he knew I was the one who'd actually look at the numbers, and asked if I could take a quick look at the home equity line on the estate. Just to make sure everything was in order before the refinance closed. I said yes, because I am, even now, the kind of daughter who says yes first and asks questions never. I didn't know yet that the favor I agreed to that night would become the very thing that ended them. I didn't know that somewhere underneath my father's calm voice was a debt structure so fragile that one wrong signature, one missed quarter, would bring the entire Callaway name down like a house built on a slope nobody had bothered to survey. I just said, "Sure, Dad. Send it over." And that was the night the countdown actually started, 11 months before anyone but Cole and I knew it was running. That night at the party was supposed to be the end of something for my parents, the clean, final severing of the two children who'd stopped being useful enough to keep around. What they didn't know, standing there under string lights with a microphone and a glass of champagne, was that it wasn't an ending at all. It was the very last moment they would ever believe they were the ones in control. The first cut is always the one you talk yourself out of feeling. Mine happened when I was 19, sitting across from my father at the kitchen table with a tuition bill for my second year of accounting school, and he slid it back across the table toward me without looking up from his newspaper. "Savannah's pageant circuit this year is going to run us close to 40,000, he said, like that was an answer. "We'll figure your school out next semester." Next semester became next year. Next year became a loan I took out myself, at 19, co-signed by no one, because my parents had decided, quietly and without ever saying it out loud, that Savannah's face was the family's actual investment portfolio and the rest of us were overhead. I didn't cry about it then. I told myself it was practical. "Pageants open doors," my mother said. "Numbers degrees do not." I believed her, the way you believe anything said often enough by the person who's supposed to love you most. Cole's version came 4 years later, and it was colder, because by then our parents had stopped even pretending there was a reason. He was 23, fresh out of his engineering program, and he'd been quietly hired onto a bridge inspection contract that would have made his career, 6 figures, his name on the report, the kind of job that changes the trajectory of a life. He told our father at Sunday dinner, expecting, I think, some small flicker of pride. Our father set down his fork, looked at him the way you'd look at a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong house, and said, "That's nice, Cole. Did you hear Savannah's getting profiled in the state paper this week? Drew's campaign team thinks it could be the thing that puts him over the top." Cole didn't say anything. He just nodded and finished his dinner. I watched him do it, watched the exact moment my brother learned what I'd already learned at 19, that there was no accomplishment large enough to earn a sentence of attention in that house, not while Savannah existed as the family's chosen export. I want you to understand the architecture of this, because it matters for everything that comes later. It wasn't cruelty in loud, dramatic bursts. It was administrative. It was a budget line, redrawn every year in our parents' minds, with Savannah's name at the top in bold and ours somewhere below the utilities. When the estate's roof needed replacing the year I turned 26, my father didn't ask Savannah, who had nothing, or himself, who had everything tied up in appearances. He asked me. "Just until the Henley account clears," he said, which was a lie, because there was no Henley account, there was just my signature on a personal loan that funded a $40,000 roof on a house I would later be told, explicitly, in front of 80 witnesses, that I was not built for. I paid it. Of course I paid it. I always paid it, because somewhere very deep in me was still a 19-year-old at a kitchen table, hoping that if I just covered enough of the bill, eventually someone would notice I was the one holding the family up. Cole's money went the same direction, just dressed differently. His firm invested $42,000 in Drew's first state senate run, money our mother framed as a family contribution, never mentioned again once the campaign won, never once acknowledged when Drew stood at podiums talking about self-made values and pulling yourself up, funded in part by the brother-in-law he wouldn't introduce at his own fundraisers. I remember the night Cole told me about it, sitting in his car outside my apartment, engine off, both of us staring at the dashboard like it owed us an explanation. "I just wanted to be useful," he said. "I just wanted, one time, for Dad to look at me the way he looks at Drew." I didn't have anything to say to that, because I'd wanted the exact same thing for a decade longer than he had, and I still didn't have it either. The escalation that finally cracked something open in both of us happened 18 months before that birthday party, at Thanksgiving. Savannah announced, over the turkey, that she and Drew were buying a lake house, a real one, 4 bedrooms, private dock, the kind of property that photographs beautifully for a senator's family. My mother clapped her hands together like Savannah had cured a disease. My father raised his glass. And then, in the same breath, in the exact same tone he'd used for the roof and the tuition and every other invoice he'd ever handed us without asking, he turned to me and said, "Nora, while we're celebrating, I do need you to look over the estate's refinance paperwork this month." Things have gotten a little tighter than usual. Tighter than usual, while his other daughter signed papers on a lake house. I looked at Cole across the table. He looked back at me. Neither of us said a word out loud. But something passed between us that night that I can only describe as a decision being made without either of us actually deciding it yet, the quiet, mutual understanding that we had spent our entire lives funding a stage that we were never allowed to stand on, and that somebody in this family was finally going to have to read the fine print. We didn't know it yet, sitting at that table with cold turkey and colder math, but the refinance paperwork my father was about to hand me wasn't just a favor. It was the first thread of a debt structure so tangled, so quietly desperate, that pulling on it correctly would eventually unravel everything he'd spent 30 years pretending was solid ground. The paperwork landed in my inbox on a Monday morning in late January, 11 months before the birthday party, and I almost didn't open it right away. I had 3 audits due that week, real clients, the kind who paid me for my time, and things have gotten a little tighter than usual sounded like the same vague, low-stakes request my father had been making my entire adult life. I opened it on my lunch break out of habit more than urgency. By the time I finished reading, my sandwich was untouched and my coffee had gone cold, because what I was looking at wasn't a simple refinance. It was a man standing on a structure so compromised that one missed quarter would bring the whole thing down, and he had no idea, none, how close he actually was to the edge. Here's what I found, laid out the way only a forensic auditor lays things out, with no feeling attached to it yet, just numbers and columns. My father had taken out a home equity line of credit against the estate 4 years earlier, for $110,000, ostensibly for renovations. The renovations existed, the roof I'd paid for among them, but the line had been drawn down far past what any renovation required. I traced the outflows. $62,000 to Savannah's pageant management company. $42,000, the exact figure Cole had told me about in his car, routed through a shell-like LLC to Drew Prescott's first campaign. Another $90,000 scattered across consulting fees that, when I pulled the invoices, turned out to be club memberships, a leased Mercedes for my mother, and a deposit on the lake house Savannah had announced over Thanksgiving turkey like it was a surprise. My father hadn't just spent beyond his means. He'd spent our future means, using the estate, the literal physical house Cole and I grew up in, as collateral for his younger daughter's image. But the home equity line was only the surface. Underneath it sat something far more dangerous, and far more interesting to a woman who reads debt for a living. My father's real estate holding company, Callaway Properties LLC, the entity that technically owned the estate and 2 smaller rental properties, had personally guaranteed a business line of credit through a regional bank, $680,000, used to prop up cash flow during a stretch when his rental income had quietly collapsed 2 years earlier and he'd never told anyone, not my mother, not Savannah, not even, I suspect, himself in any honest internal accounting. That loan was variable rate. It had reset twice already, each time at a worse number, and it was scheduled to balloon, the entire remaining balance coming due in one lump sum, in 14 months. My father was not asking me to review paperwork because he wanted a second opinion. He was asking me because some part of him, some buried, panicking part, already knew he couldn't make that payment, and some other part of him, the part that had spent 30 years not seeing me clearly, assumed I'd simply fix it the way I'd fixed the roof. Quietly. Without being asked twice. Without ever being thanked. I called Cole that night instead of calling my father back. I didn't tell him everything at first, just enough. I need you to come over, I said. I think Dad's about to lose the house. There was a long silence on the line, and then my brother, my careful, methodical brother who measures load tolerances for a living, said the thing that changed the entire shape of what came next. Lose it to who? Not a panicked question. A practical one. An engineer's question. Because Cole understood, faster than I'd expected him to, that a debt doesn't just disappear when someone can't pay it. It gets sold. It gets transferred. It ends up, eventually, in somebody's hands, and whoever's hands those are ends up holding leverage over everything the debt was secured against. He arrived at my apartment 40 minutes later with his laptop already open, and the first thing he said when he sat down at my kitchen table wasn't about our father at all. It was a question that, looking back, was the real beginning of everything. Nora, he said, how does someone go about buying distressed business debt before a bank writes it off? I want to be honest with you about that night, Because I think the audience deserves the truth more than the satisfaction of pretending we were calculating from the very first second. We weren't plotting revenge at that kitchen table. We were two adult children who had just discovered, on paper, in black and white, that the parents who'd told us our whole lives we weren't built for this family had quietly built their entire lifestyle on our labor, our loans, and our silence, and that the structure was about to collapse with or without us. The decision to be the ones standing underneath it when it fell, instead of the ones buried by it, came later. That night, we only decided one thing. We were done finding out about our family's finances after the damage was done. From here on, we would know everything first. It took Cole 6 weeks to learn the mechanics of distressed debt acquisition, and he learned it the way he learns everything, methodically, with spreadsheets, and without telling a single person outside our two-person circle what he was actually building. The regional bank holding my father's $680,000 business line of credit was a mid-sized institution, the kind that doesn't like sitting on risk it can offload, especially once a loan starts showing the early warning signs banks track quietly: late payments, a debt service coverage ratio sliding the wrong direction, a borrower whose rental income no longer matched what he'd claimed on the original application. Cole didn't approach the bank directly. He set up a private acquisition vehicle, Harrogate Capital Partners, clean, boring, the kind of name that makes loan officers relax instead of asking questions, and he began doing what distressed debt buyers do every single day, completely legally, completely invisibly. He waited for the loan to season toward a write-off, then made an offer the bank's risk department would actually want to take. It cost him $402,000 to acquire the full $680,000 note, paid in cash from the investment firm he'd spent 6 years building quietly while our parents called his career a hobby with a hard hat. The bank was relieved to clear it off their books. Cole didn't tell them who he was related to, because legally, he didn't have to, and because the moment our father's name and Cole's surname appeared in the same sentence on a transfer document, the entire plan would have unraveled before it had a chance to matter. The paperwork closed in April, 6 months before the birthday party, and on the day it did, Cole called me from the parking lot of the title company, his voice flat in the way it only goes when he's holding something enormous very, very carefully. "I own Dad's note," he said. "All of it. He just doesn't know it's me yet." I want to pause on a detail here, because I think it explains everything about who my brother actually is, underneath the quiet and the spreadsheets. Cole didn't celebrate that day. He didn't gloat. He told me later that he sat in his car for almost 20 minutes afterward, just looking at the confirmation email, feeling sick, because some childish, hopeful part of him had wanted, his whole life, for our father to simply notice him without being forced to. And now he held the literal financial leverage to force it, and it felt less like victory and more like grief for the version of this family that should have existed and never did. Meanwhile, I was working the other half of the structure. The home equity line on the estate itself, the $410,000 that had funded pageants and Mercedes leases and a lake house deposit, was held by a different lender, and it wasn't for sale the same way. But I didn't need to buy that one. I needed something better. I needed proof of exactly where every dollar of it had gone, because once Cole's note came due and the family's finances came apart in public, the question every relative, every reporter, every curious onlooker would ask was simple: how did this happen? I spent 4 months building the answer, line by line, receipt by receipt, the same forensic work I do for strangers' companies every day, except this time the company was my own family, and the fraud, because that's what misrepresenting collateral use to a lender actually is, was theirs. We weren't ready yet. Not even close. But for the first time in either of our lives, we weren't waiting to be told what we were worth. We were finding out, in dollars and documents, exactly what we'd been worth to them all along. By August, 3 months before the birthday party, I had a folder. Not metaphorically, an actual physical folder, navy blue, the kind I use for client engagements, sitting in a locked drawer in my home office, and inside it was the cleanest, most damning piece of forensic work I have ever produced. Every dollar of that $410,000 home equity line, traced and labeled. Bank statements cross-referenced against the renovation invoices my father had submitted to the lender to justify the draw. The discrepancy wasn't subtle once you laid it out properly. He told the bank the money was going toward structural repairs and an addition. In reality, less than 30% of it ever touched the house. The rest had gone to Savannah, to Drew's campaign, to my mother's club memberships, to a leased Mercedes-Benz registered in my father's name but driven exclusively by my sister. Misrepresenting the use of secured collateral to a lender isn't just embarrassing. Depending on how a bank's compliance department wants to read it, it can be classified as loan fraud, and lenders take a very different posture toward a borrower once that word enters the conversation. I didn't build that folder because I planned to hand it to a bank's fraud department, not yet, maybe not ever. I built it because I have spent my entire career learning one unbreakable rule: leverage that you cannot prove is just an opinion, and opinions don't move money. I wanted facts so airtight that if my father, or his lawyer, or anyone else ever tried to claim I was exaggerating, lying, or settling some petty emotional score, the paperwork would simply sit there, indifferent to their feelings, and speak for itself. Cole, in the meantime, had been doing something I found almost unbearably elegant in its patience. He hadn't done anything with the note. He hadn't called it due, hadn't sent a single letter, hadn't even changed the servicing address so my father would notice a new name on his statements. Harrogate Capital Partners simply continued collecting the existing monthly payments through the original servicer, invisible, silent, exactly the way my father had always treated us. I want him to walk all the way to the edge of the balloon payment still thinking he's standing on solid ground, Cole told me one night, eating cold takeout at my kitchen table, the same table where this had all started. I don't want to push him off early. I want him to jump, thinking it's still his choice. There was no cruelty in his voice when he said it. There was something closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness of a person who has spent 30 years being patient with people who never once extended him the same courtesy. We also did something neither of us is proud of, in the sense that it cost us something real to do it. We went to dinner with our parents twice that summer, deliberately, the way Cole would call a controlled load test on a structure he already suspected was failing. We wanted to see, one more time, with clean eyes, whether there was any version of this family that might still surprise us. The first dinner, my mother spent 40 minutes describing Savannah's new wallpaper choices for the Lake House nursery, since Savannah had just announced a pregnancy, and didn't ask either of us a single question about our work. The second, my father mentioned, almost as an afterthought between bites, that the refinance situation is handled, don't worry about it anymore, a lie so casual it barely registered as one to him, while sitting across from the two people who'd quietly spent the better part of a year handling it for him, in ways he could not begin to imagine. We left that second dinner in the parking lot, standing by my car in the dark, and Cole said the thing that finally closed the door on any lingering hope either of us had been carrying. They're never going to ask, he said. Not because they don't suspect something's wrong. Because asking would mean admitting they need us, and they'd rather lose the house than admit that. I didn't argue with him. I just unlocked the car, and we drove home in silence, both of us finally, completely sure of what came next. October brought the birthday party invitation, cream cardstock with gold foil lettering, celebrating 60 remarkable years, and underneath my parents' names, in smaller print, a line that told me everything I needed to know about how this night had been designed, hosted with love by Savannah and Drew Prescott. Not by my father's wife of 35 years. Not by the children who'd financed half his lifestyle without ever being asked to RSVP to their own usefulness. By Savannah. The party was being staged, quite literally, as a campaign event disguised as a family celebration, 80 guests that included 2 state legislators, a handful of donors, and a local news anchor who covered Drew's district. I understood immediately what this night actually was. It wasn't a birthday party. It was a stage for the Callaway Prescott brand, and Cole and I, somewhere in the planning, had apparently become a liability to that brand worth cutting before the cameras arrived. We found out exactly how much of a liability 9 days before the party, when Savannah called me, not to invite me properly, but to give me a heads up, her words, that she and Drew had been talking with our parents about family structure going into this next chapter, and that there might be some changes announced that night that she wanted me to hear about gently first. I asked her directly what changes. She laughed, the bright, practiced laugh she'd been using on camera since she was 11 years old, and said, "Oh, Nora, don't make this weird. It's just paperwork stuff. Dad wants the will to reflect who's actually, invested in the family going forward." Invested. I sat with that word for a long time after I hung up the phone, turning it over, thinking about the $410,000 line of credit sitting in a folder in my locked drawer, about Cole's $402,000 sitting quietly disguised as Harrogate Capital Partners, about every dollar either of us had ever handed over without being asked twice, and I thought, calmly, almost gently, that my sister had just told me, without realizing it, the exact moment our parents intended to humiliate us in public. I called Cole immediately. He didn't sound surprised, which told me he'd suspected something like this was coming for longer than he'd admitted to me. "Good," he said, and I remember being startled by how steady his voice was. "Let them do it in front of people. We need witnesses." I asked him what he meant, and he explained it the way he explained structural failures, plainly, without drama. If our parents disowned us privately, in a quiet conversation at the house, it would be deniable later, softened, walked back, explained away as a misunderstanding once the debt structure collapsed and they needed us again. But if they did it publicly, in front of 80 people, including reporters and donors who mattered to Drew's career, there would be no walking it back. There would be a room full of witnesses to exactly who we were to this family the moment before that family discovered who actually held the paper underneath their entire lives. "We're not going to stop them," Cole said. "We're going to let them build the stage themselves, and then we're going to stand on it." In the 9 days before the party, we finalized everything. I requested formal copies of the bank's complete loan file on the home equity line, citing my legal right as a co-borrower from the roof refinance years earlier, a detail my father had forgotten, or never realized, gave me standing to pull records directly. Cole quietly converted Harrogate's holding of the note into a formal demand position, the legal first step required before a balloon payment could be called, time to activate the moment he chose to trigger it. We didn't tell each other we were nervous. We didn't need to. The night before the party, Cole texted me one line, "No explanation needed between us, whatever they say tomorrow, remember it's the last time they get to say it from a position of power." I read it twice, set my phone down, and laid out the navy dress I'd wear to my own disowning, already knowing, with a calm that surprised even me, exactly how the night was actually going to end. The party itself unfolded almost exactly the way Cole had predicted, which was its own kind of strange comfort, watching a structure you'd already modeled collapse precisely along the fault lines you'd calculated. The estate's lawn had been transformed into something out of a campaign brochure: white tents, string lights, a small stage with a podium that Drew's team had clearly insisted on for remarks, and a guest list heavy with exactly the kind of people my parents had spent 30 years trying to impress. Cole and I arrived together, deliberately, both of us in dark, unremarkable clothing, the way you dress when you already know the cameras in the room aren't pointed at you and you'd like to keep it that way for a few more hours. My mother greeted us at the entrance with a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to for the nearest photographer to catch it, then immediately turned to introduce the senator standing behind us, never once looking back to see if we'd followed her into the tent. For the first 90 minutes, it was almost bearable. Cole and I drifted near the edges, watching Savannah work the room in a dress that probably cost more than either of our monthly mortgages, watching Drew shake hands with the local news anchor with the specific warmth of a man calculating exactly how many seconds of footage he was getting. I caught my father once, near the bar, and he clapped me on the shoulder, said, "Glad you could make it, Nor," in the same tone he'd used with a vendor he'd hired for the catering, and moved on before I could answer. I didn't take it personally anymore. That, more than anything, was how I knew how far we'd already traveled from the people who used to flinch at moments like that. I just watched him walk away and thought, almost clinically, "You have no idea what's in my bag tonight." The toast started around 9. A business partner of my father's went first, predictable, warm, full of golf references. Then my mother took the microphone and talked for 6 minutes about Savannah, about watching her grow into the kind of woman this family always hoped to produce, about Drew's extraordinary future and how grateful she was that the Callaway name would carry forward through people who understood what it meant to represent something. She did not say my name. She did not say Cole's name. I watched several guests glance toward us, the way people do when they sense an absence before they can name it, and I felt Cole go very still beside me, the particular stillness of a man bracing a structure he already knows is about to take a load it wasn't built for. Then my father took the microphone, and the room quieted the way rooms do for a man who still believes, on some fundamental level, that everyone in it owes him their attention. He thanked the guests. He thanked Drew specifically, by name, for everything he's building for this family's future. And then, almost as an aside, almost as if it had just occurred to him, he said it. "You know, turning 60 makes you think hard about legacy. About who's actually carrying it forward. He found us in the crowd then, Cole and me, standing near the back with our drinks untouched, and his expression did something I'd never seen it do before in 34 years, a kind of performative regret, rehearsed sorrow dressed up as honesty for an audience that would mistake it for vulnerability. Nora. Cole. Your mother and I love you, he said, but love isn't the same as fit. You were both a disappointment we tried very hard not to admit out loud. The champagne glass in his hand caught the string lights when he raised it. Somewhere near the front, I heard Savannah's phone click, already filming. My mother stepped up beside him, took his arm, and delivered her line, soft enough to sound gentle, loud enough to carry. We did everything we could for you too. Some children just aren't built for this family. I didn't look at either of them. I looked at Cole. He looked back at me, and in that single shared glance, 11 months of spreadsheets and silence and patient, methodical waiting collapsed down into one simple, mutual understanding. This was the moment. I reached into my clutch, found my phone, and under the table where no one could see, I typed 4 words to my brother, send it. Now. Both. He read them on his screen, looked up at me once, and nodded. Then, without a word to either of our parents, without a single raised voice, Cole reached into his jacket pocket and quietly pressed a single button on his phone, the trigger he'd built and tested and waited 11 months to use, the formal demand notice on a $680,000 note, sent directly to my father's lawyer, his bank, and the county recorder's office, all timestamped for delivery within the hour. Neither of us said a word to the room. We simply stood there, watching our parents smile for the cameras, completely unaware that the floor beneath their feet had just, legally and permanently, stopped being theirs. We left the party 20 minutes later, quietly. The way you leave a building you know is structurally compromised even if no one else in it has noticed the cracks yet. Nobody stopped us. My mother was already deep in conversation with the news anchor, and my father had moved on to a donor with deep pockets and deeper opinions about Drew's path to Congress. Savannah caught my eye once across the lawn, smirked, mouthed something that might have been bye, and turned back to her phone, still filming, still narrating her own highlight reel. None of them noticed that the 2 people they'd just publicly erased had simply walked to the parking lot, gotten into Cole's car, and driven away without a single word of protest, because protest had never been the plan. Documentation was. The first call came 41 hours later, not from my father, but from his lawyer, a man named Garrett Voss who'd handled the Calloway family's affairs for almost 2 decades and had clearly never had to deliver news like this in his entire career. He called me, not Cole, which told me he'd already done enough digging to understand who actually held the leverage on the home equity side. His voice had the particular brittleness of a man choosing every word with enormous care. Nora, he said, I'm going to need you to explain to me how Harrogate Capital Partners came to hold the note on your father's business line of credit. I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds before I answered, long enough for him to understand that the silence itself was an answer. You'll have to ask Cole about Harrogate, I said. I'm calling about something else entirely. I have the complete loan file on the home equity line secured against my parents' estate, and I think you're going to want to look at it before this goes any further. I could hear him sit down on the other end of the line, the small creak of an office chair absorbing news it wasn't built to carry. What followed over the next 6 hours was the kind of slow-motion collapse that happens when 2 separate pressure points fail at almost exactly the same time. Cole's demand notice had triggered a 30-day cure period under the note's terms, but the balloon clause meant the full $680,000 was now due regardless, and there was no version of my father's finances, not with the rental income shortfall I'd already documented, not with the home equity line maxed and misused, that could produce that kind of liquidity in 30 days. Meanwhile, the loan file I'd requested from the bank arrived in Voss's inbox that same afternoon, the same file I already had sitting in my locked drawer, except now it was arriving through official channels, attached to a letter I'd sent the lender's compliance department outlining, in careful, unemotional, fully documented language, that the collateral use on a $410,000 home equity line did not match what had been represented at closing. I hadn't accused anyone of fraud. I didn't need to. I'd simply laid out the receipts and let the bank's own compliance team reach their own conclusions, which they did, within days, by freezing the remaining undrawn portion of the line and opening an internal review that would, eventually, determine whether to refer the file to their fraud department at all. My father called me directly that evening, his voice doing something I had genuinely never heard it do before, cracking, just slightly, at the edges. Nora, what is happening? Garrett's talking about a balloon payment, some company called Harrogate, a bank review. I don't understand any of this. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, looking at the navy folder still open on my kitchen table, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel in this moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to a strange, clean grief. You should call Cole about Harrogate, I said again, gently, the same words I'd given his lawyer. And as for the home equity line, Dad, you should probably sit down with Mom and figure out how you're going to explain $62,000 in pageant fees and a leased Mercedes to a bank that thinks it funded a roof. There was a long silence on the other end, the sound of a man finally, for the first time in his adult life, doing math he didn't want to do. You did this, he finally said, not a question, something closer to disbelief curdling into accusation. We didn't do anything, Dad, I said, and I meant it completely. We just stopped covering for what you already did. The 30-day cure period ended on a gray Tuesday in early December, and by then, the version of my family that had stood under string lights calling us unfit had already started coming apart in ways that had nothing to do with us anymore and everything to do with arithmetic. My father couldn't produce $680,000. He tried, briefly, desperately, shopping the estate to 2 other lenders for an emergency refinance, but every appraiser who walked the property came back with the same problem. The bank's compliance freeze on the home equity line was now a matter of record, attached to the title, and no responsible lender wants to step into a property with an active fraud review hanging over its collateral history. Boss spent 2 weeks trying to negotiate a forbearance with Harrogate Capital Partners, not knowing he was negotiating with my brother, and Cole, true to the patience he'd carried through the entire 11 months, offered exactly one path forward: fair market terms, no predatory penalties, nothing either of us would ever have to be ashamed of in a courtroom or a conscience. My father simply couldn't meet them. The estate went to a structured sale in January, and Harrogate, as the senior lien holder, recovered its full position first. What remained after the home equity lender and the county taxes were satisfied amounted to $94,000, which my parents split, after 35 years of marriage, into the saddest number either of them had ever had to look at together. Savannah's world came apart in its own, separate collapse, and I want to be honest that neither Cole nor I lifted a single finger to cause it. The compliance review on the home equity line, once formally opened, became discoverable, and a local reporter, the same one who'd been at the birthday party angling for footage of Drew's extraordinary future, found the filing during a routine records search and recognized the name. The story that ran wasn't about us. It was about Drew Prescott's $42,000 first campaign contribution, routed through an LLC tied directly to misused secured debt, and about a state senator who'd spent 2 years building a brand on self-made values while quietly benefiting from collateral fraud committed by his father-in-law. Drew didn't survive the cycle. His own party asked him to step back from his re-election bid before the story finished its second news cycle, and Savannah, who had spent her entire life being the family's chosen export, found herself married to a man with no campaign left to fund the lake house they could no longer afford anyway, since the deposit on it had come from the same compromised line of credit and the sale fell through within the month. I saw my mother once more, 3 months after the party, at a deposition neither of us wanted to be at, related to the bank's eventual decision not to pursue criminal referral, a decision I'd actually advocated for, quietly, because Cole and I had never wanted prison for our father, only honesty. She looked smaller than I remembered, sitting in a borrowed conference room in clothes that weren't quite as crisp as they used to be, and when our eyes met across the table, she didn't reach for grief or performance this time. She just looked tired, the particular tiredness of a woman who'd spent 35 years building a stage that had finally, completely, run out of floor. She didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to. Some people, I've learned, will go to their graves believing the math was the betrayal, rather than the 30 years of decisions that made the math inevitable. Cole and I didn't celebrate, not the way you'd think 2 people might celebrate watching a family that wronged them lose everything. We had dinner together that week, just the 2 of us, at a small place near his office, and we talked, for the first time in either of our lives, about a future that didn't have our parents' approval anywhere in the blueprint. He's expanding Harrogate now, ethically, transparently, helping families restructure debt before it becomes a weapon someone else can pick up. I've started taking on pro bono forensic work for adult children, untangling exactly the kind of quiet financial exploitation we lived through ourselves, Because I learned something in that locked drawer with my Navy folder that I don't think I'll ever stop believing. The people who tell you you're not built for this family are very often standing on a foundation you poured yourself, and the day you stop pouring, they finally have to look down and see exactly what they were standing on the whole time. That's not revenge. That's just the truth, finally allowed to hold its own weight. And for the first time in our entire lives, my brother and I are the only two people who get to decide what gets built on it next.